Our story is about Ukraine, a land whose heart beats in rhythms older than memory, a place where rivers have carried the whispers of millennia and the soil has drunk both the rain of spring and the tears of history. Lay back, close your eyes, and imagine yourself on a gentle hill in the very center of this country, where the horizon is a low curve of golden wheat and the air tastes faintly of sun-warmed grass. From here, we can see the past roll out before us like a boundless plain. The Dnipro River glimmers below, wide and slow, its surface carrying the reflection of moonlight, as if it were silver poured in motion. Its banks are lined with willows whose roots have touched these waters for generations beyond counting. You hear nothing but the faint sigh of the wind moving through the grass, and the distant, almost imagined sound of a flute, perhaps from centuries ago, played by a shepherd who stood on this same hill. In Ukraine, time is not a straight road, but a winding path that threads through forests, steppe, mountains, and shore, looping back on itself in stories that refuse to fade. To the west rise the blue folds of the Carpathian Mountains, cloaked in spruce and beech. Their peaks are not sharp, but anciently worn, like the shoulders of elders who have stood too long against the wind. Their valleys hold wooden churches built without nails, their walls smelling faintly of resin and smoke. In the south, the Black Sea waits with its shifting moods, sometimes glassy and warm, sometimes restless with storms. On its northern shores, the salt wind mixes with the scents of wild thyme and sun-bleached stone. Between mountain and sea stretches the great Ukrainian steppe, a rolling ocean of grass that turns silver under the moon and gold in the morning light. A place where horses once ran free in uncountable herds, and nomads follow the seasons like constellations across the earth. This is the canvas on which all of Ukraine's history will be painted. Here, people have hunted with flint-tipped spears, traded silk for amber, sung epic songs by the fire, and written poetry in cramped candlelight. Empires have risen and fallen across these plains, each leaving a shadow in the soil, a word in the language, a shape in the music. Yet through all of it, the land has remained, a patient witness to every triumph and sorrow. Tonight, we will walk with that land. We will step softly into its first dawns, stand in its crowded marketplaces, march through its battles, and sit in its quiet kitchens. We will feel each century pass like the slow flow of the river. Now, take a breath and let the long journey begin. Breathe deeply and let the air fill with the scent of ancient earth, warmed by a sun that has risen and set here for hundreds of thousands of years. Long before any kingdom or border existed, this land was already old. The soil beneath our feet holds traces of people who walked here in the Paleolithic age, leaving behind chipped flints and the bones of mammoths they hunted. Imagine standing on a low ridge above a river valley. Not a town or road in sight, only endless grassland and scattered clusters of birch trees swaying gently. A small fire crackles, its smoke curling into the evening sky as a group of hunters in furs crouch around it, sharing meat and stories in a language no longer spoken. Time moves, but slowly. We drift forward to the Neolithic period, when the first seeds are pressed into the black, rich earth. Villages begin to form, round huts of clay and wood rising along the riverbanks. It is here, nearly 7,000 years ago, that one of the most remarkable prehistoric cultures in Europe takes shape: the Tripolian culture. Their settlements are astonishing for their time. Vast, sometimes containing thousands of inhabitants, laid out in concentric circles like ripples on a pond. Within each home, hearths glow warmly, and walls are painted in reds and whites, spirals and sun symbols dancing over clay. Women tend to the fields, their hands sinking into the loamy soil, planting wheat and barley. Potters shape vessels with elegant curves and swirling patterns, each one not only a tool but a piece of art. The people keep herds of cattle, weave linen, and tell myths under the same constellations we still see tonight. In these early days, the land is generous. The rivers, the Dnipro, the Dniester, the southern bug, are lifelines. Glistening threads tying together far-flung settlements. Boats, carved from single tree trunks, glide silently over the water, carrying grain, salt, and pottery between communities. Children chase each other through the tall grass, while elders teach them the stories of the earth and sky, how the stork brings luck, how the oak holds the wisdom of the ancestors. Centuries pass in a slow rhythm of planting, harvesting, and watching the stars. But the openness of the Ukrainian steppe, so rich for farming, also makes it a crossroads, and crossroads invite travelers. From the east and south, nomadic tribes begin to appear. The Cimmerians first, swift riders armed with bronze weapons. Then the Scythians, whose very name will echo across the ancient world. Imagine their arrival: a low dust cloud on the horizon, the drumming of hooves growing louder until the steppe itself seems to tremble. They are masters of mounted archery, their arrows flying with deadly precision, even as their horses gallop at full speed. The Scythians are not merely warriors. They are traders and artisans. Their goldsmiths craft intricate ornaments, stylized deer, panthers, and birds of prey, each piece gleaming in the firelight. Burial mounds, called kurgans, rise over the plains, grassy hills that hide treasures meant to accompany their dead into the next world. Beneath one such mound, a king lies in a chamber lined with felt, surrounded by weapons, jewelry, and even the bodies of sacrificed horses. Above ground, the wind sighs over the grass, and the mound becomes just another curve in the endless horizon. To the south, the Black Sea's coast begins to stir with foreign voices. Greek traders from cities like Miletus and Rhodes sail northward, their ships heavy with amphorae of wine and olive oil. They establish colonies such as Olbia, Chersonesus, and Tyrus, their whitewashed stone walls gleaming under the sun. Within these settlements, the scent of grilled fish mixes with the tang of the sea, and the streets echo with a murmur of markets where Greek, Scythian, and Thracian words mingle. The exchange is not only in goods, but in ideas, philosophies, religious practices, and new technologies find their way inland along the river routes. Further east, along the shore, lies the Crimean Peninsula, a jewel of rolling hills in sheltered bays. Here, Greek influence blends with that of the native Tauric tribes, whose stone fortresses watch over the cliffs. On certain evenings, smoke rises from their hilltop sanctuaries, where offerings are made to gods of the sea and sky. The coastline becomes a tapestry of cultures, each adding a thread to Ukraine's story. By the early centuries of the first millennium BCE, the land is a meeting place of worlds. The agricultural heartland of the Tripolins has given way to the fluid dominance of nomadic riders, and the coastal zones hum with Mediterranean trade. The balance between settled and wandering life shapes everything: the architecture, the art, the rhythms of war and peace. Then, in the centuries around the turn of the Common Era, new forces arrive. The Sarmatians ride westward, displacing some Scythian groups, while in the forests of the North Slavic tribes begin to organize their own distinct ways of life. They clear small fields among the trees, build timber houses with thatched roofs, and weave dense networks of kinship and alliance. Life is quieter here than on the steppe. Evenings spent around the hearth, weaving baskets, carving wood, telling tales of spirits that live in rivers and groves. But even here, far from the great trade routes, the world is changing. The Roman Empire casts its long shadow over the Black Sea, sending diplomats, merchants, and sometimes soldiers into contact with these lands. Roman glass beads find their way into Slavic villages, while furs, honey, and amber make their way south to imperial markets. Somewhere, perhaps in a clearing where wildflowers grow thick, a storyteller sits cross-legged before a circle of listeners. In a voice that rises and falls like the wind in the reeds, he tells of great rivers that never end, of horses that can outrun the sun, of gods who walk disguised among men. Outside the circle, the land listens too. It has seen cultures rise and fall, languages spoken and forgotten, but it holds each one gently in its memory, like layers of soil built up over millennia. And so, the stage is set for the next transformations. The peoples who will one day call themselves Ukrainians are still centuries away, but their land, rich in rivers, forests, mountains, and steppe, has already become a bridge between worlds. The air carries the mingled scents of sea salt and meadow flowers, of hearth smoke and fresh cut wood. If you listen closely, you might almost hear the sound of a loom weaving together the first threads of a nation's long and intricate fabric. You're safe now. The night is calm, and our story moves gently into the mists of the first millennium. The rivers run quietly under the moon, silver ribbons threading through a vast, fertile land. It is here, in these centuries, that the great turning begins, when scattered tribes and trading posts start to weave themselves into the first true state of what will one day be Ukraine. The Slavic tribes of the forests and river valleys have grown in number. They fish in clear waters, tend fields of rye and barley, and craft wooden houses along the Dnipro, the Desna, and the Pripyat. To the north, dense forests hum with life. To the south, the steppe still opens like a great golden sea. The land between them is a living artery, carrying goods and ideas between the Baltic and the Black Sea. Traders have begun to call this route the way from the Varangians to the Greeks, a path of water, and portage, winding from the lands of the Norsemen down to the markets of Byzantium. The Varangians, Scandinavian adventurers and merchants, are drawn to this route like moths to flame. They arrive in long, sleek ships, carved with dragon-headed prows, their sails snapping in the wind. Some come for trade, bringing furs, honey, and slaves southward, and carrying silk, spices, and silver northward. Others come for conquest. Legend tells of a Varangian prince named Rurik who establishes his rule in the far north at Novgorod. His kinsman Oleg, a shrewd and ambitious leader, pushes further south and, in the year 882, captures Kyiv, a wooden fortress town perched on high bluffs above the Dnipro. Standing in the cool dawn mist, Oleg proclaims Kyiv the mother of Rus cities, a center from which his realm will radiate. Kyiv is perfectly placed, far enough upriver to be safe from constant steppe raids, but close enough to control the vital trade artery to the Black Sea. Under Oleg and his successors, it becomes a hub of power, diplomacy, and wealth. The rulers of this land, the princes of the Rurikid dynasty, balance war with commerce, making alliances when it suits them, raiding when it does not. One of them, Prince Igor, meets his end in 945 at the hands of the Drevlians, a neighboring tribe who kill him for excessive tribute demands. His widow, Princess Olga responds not with open war, but with calculated vengeance, burning their city and binding them to Kyiv's authority. Later, she travels to Constantinople, where the vast domes of Hagia Sophia rise above her. There, she is baptized into Christianity, planting the first seeds of a faith that will soon transform her realm. That transformation comes under her grandson, Vladimir the Great, ruling from 980 to 1015. Vladimir is remembered not only as a warrior, but as the man who brought Christianity to Kievan Rus. The chronicles tell how he considered the faiths of neighboring peoples, Islam from the Volga Bulgars, Judaism from the Khazars, Western Christianity from the Latin West, but ultimately embraced Eastern Orthodoxy after sending envoys to Constantinople. They returned, awed by the beauty of Byzantine worship, saying they did not know whether they were in heaven or on earth inside Hagia Sophia. In 988, Vladimir orders the baptism of Kyiv's inhabitants in the Dnipro River. Picture it, hundreds of people standing waist deep in the cool water. The summer sun shimmering off the surface, priests chanting while the scent of incense drifts across the breeze. Churches rise where pagan shrines once stood, icons are painted, and the rhythms of the Byzantine liturgy begin to echo through the city. This moment binds Kievan Rus spiritually and culturally to the Orthodox world, linking it to the grandeur of Byzantium. Vladimir's son, Yaroslav the Wise, carries the realm to its golden age. From 1019 to 1054, he turns Kyiv into a city of stone and learning. He commissions the magnificent St. Sophia Cathedral, its green domes and golden crosses gleaming above the city, its walls covered in mosaics of Christ, saints, and rulers. He founds libraries, promotes the codification of laws in the Rimskaya Pravda, and marries his children into the royal families of France. The markets overflow with goods, honey, wax, furs, and slaves bound for Constantinople. Silks, wine, and precious stones arriving from afar. Pilgrims, merchants, and diplomats passed through the city gates, speaking a dozen languages. But golden ages rarely last. After Yaroslav's death, the unity of Kievan Rus begins to fray. His sons divide the realm among themselves, and their descendants quarrel endlessly. The princes of Kyiv, Chernihiv, Pereslav, and other cities feud, drawing in steppe nomads as allies or enemies. The Polovtsians, Turkic horsemen of the steppe, raid deep into the river valleys, their arrows darkening the sky. Songs of their clashes with the princes fill the lay of Igor's campaign, a poem that blends history with myth, lamenting the disunity of the Rus. Meanwhile, the economic heart of the land shifts. As the Byzantine Empire faces its own troubles, trade along the Dnipro declines. New centers rise in the north and west, and Kyiv's power wanes. In 1169, Prince Andrei Bogolubsky of Vladimir Suzdal sacks Kyiv, not to rule it, but to humble it. The city never fully recovers its former glory. The final blow comes in the 13th century from a force unlike any the Rus have faced before: the Mongols. In 1240, Bata Khan's armies arrive, their disciplined cavalry moving like a storm across the steppe. They besiege Kyiv for weeks, battering its walls with siege engines until they collapse. The Mongols pour in, burning, looting, killing. When the smoke clears, the once great city lies in ruins, its population scattered or slain. The survivors live under the shadow of the Golden Horde, paying tribute to their distant khans. Yet, even in this time of devastation, the cultural threads spun in the Kievan era do not vanish. The Orthodox faith endures. The memory of Kyiv as a mother city remains in the hearts of its people. Towns and villages rebuild slowly, their wooden churches rising once more, their fields replanted. Life bends under foreign rule, but does not break. To the west, a different current begins to flow. In Galicia and Volhynia, far from the Mongol heartlands, a principality flourishes under princes like Danilo Romanovich. Crowned king of Ruthenia by a papal envoy in 1253, Danilo builds stone castles, encourages trade, and maintains ties with both Western and Eastern powers. His cities, such as Lviv, attract craftsmen, merchants, and settlers from across Europe. In Lviv's markets, Ruthenian peasants, Armenian traders, and German artisans rub shoulders, their voices mingling in a chorus of commerce. By the late 14th century, however, the political map shifts again. Much of Western Ukraine comes under the control of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, whose rulers promise protection from the Mongols and allow local customs and Orthodox faith to continue. The Lithuanian princes, and later the Polish kings through the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, will shape the land's destiny for centuries to come. But the deep roots planted in the Kievan era, the Orthodox Church, the Cyrillic script, the memory of a unified realm along the Dnipro will remain in the soil, ready to bloom again when the time comes. The river flows on, reflecting starlight. Somewhere along its banks, an old fisherman pulls in his net, heavy with the night's catch. Above him, the wind moves softly through the reeds, whispering stories of princes and warriors, of golden domes and burning walls, of a city that rose, shone, and fell, but whose spirit is still carried in the hearts of those who call this land home. The river Dnipro is wide here, its slow-moving waters catching the light of a pale dawn. By the time we reach the 14th and 15th centuries, the Mongol shadow over Kyiv has begun to thin. Though their influence lingers in tribute, in customs, and in the wary way people still look east when the horizon darkens. Much of western and central Ukraine now lies within the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, a vast and surprisingly tolerant realm where Ruthenian language, Orthodox faith, and local laws remain respected. In town squares, you hear Lithuanian nobles speaking with Ruthenian scribes, and documents are often written in the Old East Slavic tongue rather than in Lithuanian. There is no attempt to erase the past. Rather, the duchy folds it into a new political fabric. By the late 14th century, Lithuania has stretched far enough that it meets Poland in ambition and territory. In 1386, a royal marriage unites the two powers, the Grand Duke of Lithuania, Jogila, weds Queen Jadwiga of Poland, becoming King Władysław II Jagiwa of Poland. Over time, this union will tighten, culminating in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth of 1569, a sprawling and multi-ethnic federation that encompasses much of modern-day Ukraine. For the Ukrainian lands, this shift brings both opportunity and tension. To the west, in cities like Lviv, trade thrives, merchants' guilds grow wealthy, and cobbled streets echo with the sounds of multiple languages: Polish, Armenian, German, Yiddish, Ruthenian. Catholic churches rise alongside Orthodox ones, their spires competing gently with onion domes on the skyline. The University of Lviv, founded in the 17th century, becomes a center of learning, drawing scholars from far beyond Galicia. Yet, in the countryside, life feels different. The Commonwealth's system of noble landholding deepens serfdom, binding peasants more tightly to the estates of Polish and Polonized Lithuanian magnates. The Orthodox faith, though tolerated, is not the faith of the ruling elite, and tensions grow over church rights and land ownership. The Union of Brest in 1596, which brings part of the Orthodox hierarchy into communion with Rome as the Aeneid Greek Catholic Church, further complicates loyalties. Some welcome the bridge between East and West. Others see it as an erosion of tradition. South of the settled farmlands, the steppe still breathes freedom and danger. Here, along the lower Dnipro, a new force emerges: the Cossacks, born of frontier necessity and a restless spirit. The Cossacks are part warrior, part farmer, part pirate. They are runaway serfs, adventurers, and even exiled nobles drawn to the open lands where no lord claims dominion. Their home is the Zaporizhian Sich, a fortified camp beyond the Dnipro Rapids, where discipline and democracy blend in unusual ways. The Sich is a brotherhood. Its members elect their hetman leader, share spoils equally, and hold councils under the open sky. By day, they ride swift horses across the steppe, their sabers and muskets glinting in the sun. By night, they sit around great fires, singing songs of battle and loss, their voices carrying over the reeds. They defend Orthodox villages from Tatar slave raids, but they also launch their own daring expeditions. Down the Dnipro, across the Black Sea, striking at Ottoman fortresses on the coast. These raids, sometimes sanctioned by the Commonwealth and sometimes not, make them both feared and respected. Cossacks are more than fighters. They keep alive folk songs and epic poems about Kyiv's golden age, about princes and saints, about the defense of faith and land. In their ranks, a peasant can become a leader if he proves his courage and cunning. They wear bright sashes and shave their heads except for a single long lock of hair, the ocelodets, which dances in the wind as they ride. The relationship between the Cossacks and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth is uneasy. The Commonwealth needs them as a military buffer against the Ottomans and Crimean Tatars, but fears their independence and Orthodox fervor. Attempts to limit their numbers or control their raids spark repeated uprisings. One of the most famous is the Khmelnytsky Uprising of 1648, led by Bohdan Khmelnytsky, a charismatic hetman whose grievances, personal, political, and religious, ignite a massive rebellion. The uprising sweeps across central and eastern Ukraine. Towns and castles fall. Catholic landlords and their allies are driven out. Jewish communities, tragically, face brutal massacres in the chaos. Khmelnytsky wins stunning victories and seeks alliances with the Crimean Khanate, playing the great powers against each other. His goal is not merely to punish the Commonwealth, but to secure Cossack autonomy, a state within a state. By 1654, the war has drawn in another power, Muscovy. The Treaty of Pereslav between the Cossacks and the Tsar promises protection in exchange for allegiance, though the exact terms remain contested in memory and meaning. What follows is a slow but steady pull of the left bank east of the Dnipro into Moscow's orbit, while the right bank remains under Polish influence. The unity Khmelnytsky dreamed of splinters into the geopolitical tug-of-war that will define Ukraine's fate for centuries. Yet, even in division, the Cossack legacy endures. Their songs, banners, and stories seep into the identity of the people. In villages along the river, old men recount tales of Khmelnytsky's cunning and the bravery of the Sich warriors. In Orthodox churches, the icons gleam in candlelight, their gold leaf catching the eye like the stepson on a Cossack's saber. The land remembers and carries forward this fierce, free-spirited heritage. The winter winds over the Dnipro carry the faint scent of wood smoke. And by the late 17th century, the lines on the map have shifted once again. The Treaty of Androsovo in 1667 formalizes what years of war have already made clear. The left bank of Ukraine, with Kyiv included, is now firmly under the Tsardom of Muscovy, while the right bank remains with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This division, slicing through the heart of the land, begins to shape two parallel destinies. On the left bank, the Cossack hetmanate retains a measure of autonomy under Moscow's suzerainty. Its hetmans still hold councils known as Rada and maintain their military traditions, though Moscow appoints overseers and increasingly draws authority to itself. Kyiv, long a spiritual beacon, becomes a vital center for the Orthodox Church under Moscow's control, with the Kyiv Academy producing theologians, philosophers, and scholars who influence the entire Orthodox world. But the freedoms the Cossacks once defended so fiercely begin to erode. Moscow's decrees tighten. Hetmanate elections are manipulated. Reforms under Peter the Great and Catherine the Great will dismantle the hetmanate entirely, replacing it with Russian imperial administration. Meanwhile, the right bank remains under the Commonwealth, though it is a restless and war-torn region. The Ottomans press from the south. The Crimean Tatars still raid, and uprisings periodically flare among the peasantry. Polish nobles control vast estates, while Ukrainian peasants endure the burdens of serfdom. The Orthodox Church here struggles under Catholic dominance, and the Greek Catholic Church gains influence in many communities, blending Eastern liturgy with allegiance to Rome. By the end of the 18th century, the fate of both sides of the Dnipro is sealed by the Great Partitions of Poland 1772, 1793, 1795, in which the Russian Empire, the Habsburg monarchy, and Prussia carve up the once mighty Commonwealth. Nearly all Ukrainian lands come under imperial rule, the bulk to Russia and Galicia, along with parts of Volhynia and Bukovina to Austria. The Cossack Sich is destroyed in 1775 by Russian troops. Its wooden palisades are torn down, its leaders scattered to the steppes or absorbed into imperial service. The frontier freedom that had defined Zaporizhian life dissolves into the rigid hierarchies of empire. In the Russian-controlled lands, Catherine the Great's policies encouraged settlement by Russians, Serbs, Germans, and others, especially in the fertile new Russia territories of the south, including Odessa, Kherson, and Mykolaiv. These cities, built along the Black Sea, become cosmopolitan ports where Greek merchants, Italian architects, and Jewish traders mingle in bustling markets. Yet for Ukrainian peasants, life remains tied to the soil, bound by serfdom until its abolition in 1861. The countryside echoes with folk songs and the creak of wooden plows, with traditions preserved in embroidered shirts, vegetables, and the slow tolling of church bells. Under Austrian rule in Galicia, conditions differ. While Poles dominate the nobility and administration, the Austrian bureaucracy allows more space for local cultural life. Ukrainian, then often called Ruthenian, priests, teachers, and writers begin to cultivate a sense of national identity, drawing from both folk traditions and modern political thought. In Lviv, printing presses produce books in the vernacular. Societies for education and culture emerge, and the seeds of the Ukrainian national revival are sown earlier than in the Russian domains, where the imperial government is more repressive toward local language and identity. The 19th century brings a quiet but profound awakening. In Russian-ruled Ukraine, intellectuals like Taras Shevchenko, poet, painter, and former serf, give voice to the longing for freedom and the dignity of the peasant. Becomes a cultural touchstone passed from hand to hand, often in secret. Shevchenko's verses evoke the Cossack past, the beauty of the Ukrainian landscape, and the pain of oppression, and they resonate far beyond the educated elite. Other figures, such as historian Mykola Hrushevsky, later in Galicia, ethnography Mykola Kostomarov, and publicist Panteleimon Kulish, work to record and elevate and traditions. Their efforts face censorship. The Valuev Circular of 1863 and the EM's Ukaz of 1876, issued by the Russian authorities, severely restrict the publication and public use of the Ukrainian language, aiming to suppress what is seen as a separatist tendency. Yet, this repression only strengthens the resolve of those who see culture as a form of resistance. In the cities, industrialization changes the rhythm of life. In the Donbas, coal mines and steel mills rise, drawing workers from across the empire. Kharkiv, Kyiv, and Katerynoslav, now Dnipro, expand with railways, factories, and new neighborhoods. Urban Ukrainians find themselves living alongside Russians, Jews, Poles, and others, creating a multilingual, multi-ethnic environment. The contrast between the cosmopolitan cities and the deeply traditional countryside grows sharper. In Galicia, under Austria-Hungary, the late 19th century becomes a time of increasingly organized Ukrainian political and cultural activity. Reading societies, cooperatives, and political parties form. The Greek Catholic Church plays a central role in education and moral leadership. Ukrainian deputies sit in the imperial parliament in Vienna and in the Galician Diet in Lviv, though often overshadowed by Polish dominance. The folk culture of the Carpathian highlands. The Hutzels, with their bright woven patterns and carved wooden houses, becomes a romanticized symbol of authenticity, celebrated in literature and art, despite living under different empires. Ukrainians on both sides of the old Dnipro divide share a growing awareness of a common identity rooted in language, folk tradition, and a shared historical memory of the Cossack era and Kievan Rus, newspapers, books, and the circulation of ideas, sometimes smuggled across borders, help weave these threads into a more coherent national fabric. As the 20th century dawns, the winds of change sweep across Europe. Industrial workers strike for better conditions. Peasants demand land reform. And nationalist movements stir among Poles, Czechs, Finns, and others. In Ukraine, the dream of autonomy, or even independence, begins to feel less like a distant song and more like a possibility. But before it can be grasped, the land will be plunged into the storms of world war and revolution, where identities will be tested, borders redrawn, and the fate of Ukraine will hang in the balance. The summer of 1914 began with the smell of freshly cut hay and the hum of insects in the fields. Yet, in the cities and garrisons, the air grew tense. A gunshot in Sarajevo set in motion forces that would engulf all of Europe and Ukraine. Divided between the Russian Empire in the east and Austria-Hungary in the west, found itself on both sides of the front line. Young men from Kyiv and Kharkiv marched eastward under the double-headed eagle of Russia, while those from Lviv and the Carpathians donned the uniforms of the Habsburg army. Brothers, cousins, and former classmates now fought under different banners, often against each other, across trenches and mountain passes. In Galicia, the opening months of the war saw brutal battles as Russian forces surged westward into Austro-Hungarian territory. Lviv fell to the Russians in September 1914, and the occupation brought sweeping changes. Orthodox churches reopened in place of Greek Catholic ones. Russian became the official language, and thousands suspected of pro-Ukrainian or pro-Polish sympathies were deported deep into the empire. When the Russians were pushed back by 1915 during the Gorlice offensive, Austro-Hungarian authorities retaliated against those suspected of collaboration, sending many Ukrainians to internment camps like the notorious Talahov. The war, for ordinary villagers, meant burned homes, shifting rulers, and sons who never returned. In the Russian-controlled lands, the war effort strained an already fragile empire. Kyiv streets filled with wounded soldiers and long bread lines. In the Donbass, coal production struggled under wartime requisitions, while in the countryside, requisition squads stripped barns and granaries for the army. The Tsar's regime, suspicious of Ukrainian cultural activity, cracked down even harder on nationalist societies, closing publications and arresting activists. Yet, in the chaos of war, underground networks also grew bolder, passing letters and pamphlets between villages and cities. Amid the imperial armies, Ukrainians also formed their own military units. In Galicia, the Ukrainian Sich Riflemen, a volunteer corps within the Austro-Hungarian forces, fought both in the Carpathian passes and on the Eastern Front. Wearing their distinct gray-green uniforms and carrying a strong national spirit, they became a symbol of the idea that Ukraine could field its own army, loyal not to Vienna or St. Petersburg, but to the dream of an independent homeland. By 1917, the war had exhausted the Russian Empire. Hunger stalked the cities, strikes paralyzed factories, and soldiers deserted in droves. The February Revolution swept away the Tsar, replacing him with a Russian provisional government. In Kyiv, news of the revolution arrived like a warm wind breaking a long winter. Political clubs sprang to life. Flags of blue and yellow appeared in demonstrations. And in March 1917, the Central Rada, a Ukrainian representative assembly, was formed. Led by historian Mikhailo Hrushevsky, the Rada declared itself the voice of the Ukrainian people, demanding autonomy within a federated Russia. The provisional government in Petrograd hesitated, offering vague promises but little concrete power. Over the months, tensions grew. The Rada issued its universal proclamations, asserting increasing degrees of self-governance while also trying to organize administration, land reform, and a national army in the midst of the ongoing World War. Ukrainian language schools opened, newspapers flourished, and the streets of Kyiv rang with political debate, sometimes in cafes, sometimes at open-air meetings in the squares. Then came October 1917, and with it, the Bolshevik seizure of power in Petrograd. The Central Rada refused to recognize the Bolshevik government, declaring in its fourth universal in January 1918 the full independence of the Ukrainian people. Republic UPAR. It was a bold move, but one made in a storm. Bolshevik forces were already advancing toward Kyiv, aiming to bring Ukraine under Soviet control. In February, after fierce fighting, they seized the city. The Rada fled, turning to Germany and Austria-Hungary for aid under the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. German and Austro-Hungarian troops pushed the Bolsheviks out, but their presence came at a cost. The occupiers requisitioned vast amounts of grain to feed their own war-depleted populations, clashing with Ukrainian peasants. In April 1918, with German backing, the Rada was replaced by the Hetmanate under Pavle Skoropadsky, a conservative regime promising order, property rights, and close ties to the Central Powers. His government emphasized building institutions, universities, an Academy of Sciences, and state archives. Yet its reliance on foreign military support and its conservative stance alienated many Ukrainian socialists and peasants. By the autumn of 1918, the Central Powers were collapsing. The Hetmanate fell, replaced by the Directory, led by Simon Petliura and Volodymyr Vinichenko, which tried to restore the Ukrainian People's Republic. But Ukraine was now a battlefield for multiple armies: Bolsheviks from the north and east, White Russian forces under Denikin, Polish troops from the west, anarchist insurgents led by Nestor Makhno in the south, and remnants of the Austro-Hungarian and German forces withdrawing through the countryside. The Civil War period, known as the Ukrainian War of Independence, 1917 to 1921, was one of shifting alliances, sudden betrayals, and unrelenting hardship for civilians. Villages changed hands multiple times in a single season. Epidemics of typhus and influenza spread through armies and towns alike. Meanwhile, in western Ukraine, the end of Austria-Hungary in late 1918 brought its own upheaval. In Lviv, Ukrainian officers and officials proclaimed the West Ukrainian People's Republic, ZUNR, claiming eastern Galicia, but Polish forces quickly contested the region. The Polish-Ukrainian War erupted with fierce street fighting in Lviv and battles across the countryside. Despite initial successes, the ZUNR was pushed back by mid-1919, and the territory was incorporated into the Second Polish Republic, though not without ongoing resistance and bitterness among the local Ukrainian population. In 1919, the UPR and ZUNR tried to unite, signing an Act of Union in Kyiv, symbolically binding eastern and western Ukrainian lands. But the gesture was more aspirational than practical. Both governments were under severe military pressure, and coordination was difficult. Petliura's forces, harried by Bolsheviks and whites alike, were forced into retreat after retreat. By 1920, Petliura allied with Poland in a desperate bid to regain Kyiv, launching the Kyiv offensive. The joint forces briefly took the city, but a swift Soviet counteroffensive pushed them back into Polish territory. The subsequent Polish-Soviet War ended with the Treaty of Riga in 1921, which partitioned Ukraine. The eastern and central regions became the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic within the USSR, while western lands, Galicia, Volhynia, and parts of Policia, remained in Poland. Bukovina went to Romania, and Transcarpathia became part of Czechoslovakia. The dream of a united, independent Ukraine had slipped away. But the memory of 1917 to 1921 would echo for decades. The experience forged a generation of political leaders, soldiers, and intellectuals who carried the ideal of independence into exile and underground movements. In villages, folk songs remembered the Cossack flags flying again, if only for a brief time. In cities, secret meetings kept alive the idea that Ukraine was not merely a province or a borderland, but a nation in its own right. The 1920s would open a new chapter, one of Soviet rule in the East, Polish domination in the West, and the complex survival of Ukrainian culture under very different regimes. But for those who lived through the war and revolution years, the images remained vivid. The blue and yellow banners over Kiev's Sofia Square, the clatter of boots on Lviv's cobblestones, the hunger in the villages, and the hope that had burned so brightly, even as the winds of empire closed in once more. The 1920s settled over Ukraine not as a gentle dawn, but as a thick, complicated fog. The Treaty of Riga had fixed the borders, splitting the land between Soviet rule in the east and foreign control in the west. But it had not resolved the deeper struggle for identity and survival. In the east, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic became one of the founding members of the newly formed Soviet Union in 1922. Its blue and yellow banners replaced with a red flag and hammer and sickle. In the west, Galicia and Volhynia were absorbed into the Second Polish Republic, while Bukovina fell under Romania's crown and Transcarpathia joined Czechoslovakia. Families were divided not just by geography, but by political systems, currencies, and languages of administration. In Soviet Ukraine, the first years under Bolshevik rule were a balancing act. The government, eager to consolidate its hold on a restive population, adopted a policy of Ukrainization in the 1920s, encouraging the use of the Ukrainian language in schools, government offices, and publications. Ukrainian literature, art, and theater flourished, and new institutions like the Academy of Sciences in Kyiv fostered a sense of cultural pride. Figures like Mykola Kavalavi stirred debates about the direction of Ukrainian culture within the Soviet framework, calling for a turn toward European cultural models rather than blind imitation of Russian ones. Streets in cities that had once been dominated by Russian language signs began to display Ukrainian lettering. Newspapers carried both local and world news in a language many had not seen in print for decades. Yet this flowering existed within the strict boundaries of communist ideology. Political dissent was swiftly suppressed, and the security apparatus, the Cheka, later the GPU, kept close watch on nationalist tendencies. The memory of the Ukrainian People's Republic made the Bolsheviks wary of allowing too much autonomy, even in cultural matters. Still, for many Ukrainians, the 1920s offered a fragile window of revival after the chaos of war. In the countryside, the rhythms of farming life continued, but under new pressures. The Soviet state introduced land reforms and began experimenting with collectivization, merging individual farms into collective units, or kolkhozes. At first, these were promoted as voluntary associations, promising shared equipment and resources. But many peasants resisted, wary of losing their land and autonomy. Meanwhile, in western Ukraine, under Polish rule, the interwar period brought its own tensions. The Polish government pursued policies of Polonization, favoring the Polish language in administration and education, limiting Ukrainian political activity, and settling Polish veterans on land in predominantly Ukrainian areas. Ukrainian schools were closed or converted to Polish ones, and the Greek Catholic Church often found itself in a delicate position between advocating for its flock and avoiding direct confrontation with Warsaw. Political organizations like the Ukrainian National Democratic Alliance, UNDO, tried to work within the system, while more radical groups, such as the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, AUM, emerged in the late 1920s, willing to use sabotage and assassination in pursuit of independence. The fragile balance in Soviet Ukraine collapsed abruptly with the rise of Joseph Stalin's rule in the late 1920s. Stalin viewed Ukraine, with its fertile farmland, history of independence movements, and proximity to the West, as both a critical asset and a potential threat. His push for rapid industrialization in the early 1930s would strike the Ukrainian countryside with devastating force. By 1929, collectivization was no longer optional. Armed brigades arrived in villages, requisitioning grain, seizing livestock, and punishing those who resisted. Wealthier peasants, labeled kulaks, were arrested, deported, or executed, but in practice, anyone opposing the policy could be targeted. The state's grain quotas were impossibly high, leaving little for local consumption. The countryside began to empty of food as shipments went to feed cities and fulfill export contracts. In 1930 to 1933, these policies, compounded by poor harvests and the sealing of Ukraine's borders to prevent peasants from seeking food elsewhere, led to one of the most catastrophic famines in human history, the Holodomor. Entire villages were reduced to silence. Fields lay fallow as people, too weak to work, lay in their homes or on roadsides. Parents buried children in shallow graves. Neighbors disappeared without a word. Soviet authorities denied the famine's existence, continued to requisition grain, and punished those who spoke of hunger. Estimates of the dead range from 3 to 5 million in Ukraine alone. For those who survived, the memory was seared into their bones, a trauma passed down in whispered stories decades later. Even as famine raged in the countryside, the cultural thaw of the 1920s ended abruptly. The policy of Ukrainization was reversed. The 1930s saw the executed Renaissance, a generation of Ukrainian writers, artists, and intellectuals silenced through arrest, exile, or execution. Mykola Kyiv, unable to bear the tightening ideological noose, took his own life in 1933. The poet Mykola Zyrov, playwright Les Kurbas, and historian Mikhailo Yalovy were among hundreds shot during Stalin's purges. Ukrainian language publications were shut down or strictly censored. Russian became the dominant language of state and education once more. While repression deepened in Soviet Ukraine, Western Ukraine lived under the constraints of Polish rule until the outbreak of World War II. In the 1930s, tensions between Polish authorities and Ukrainian activists grew more violent, with sabotage campaigns, retaliatory arrests, and political assassinations on both sides. The AUN, particularly its younger faction, led by Stepan Bandera, gained notoriety for militant nationalism. Though small in number, its members dreamed of a coming war in which they could carve out an independent Ukraine from the collapse of surrounding empires. In Soviet-held territories, the late 1930s brought another wave of suffering through the Great Purge. Party officials, Red Army officers, and ordinary citizens alike were accused of treason or nationalist sympathies. Show trials in Kyiv and Kharkov condemned alleged conspirators, while the forests and prison cells of the USSR swallowed countless victims. And yet, amid the fear, the machine of Soviet modernization kept moving. Industrial centers like Kharkov, Dnipro Petrovsk, and Zaporizhia grew rapidly, fueled by new factories, dams, and mines. The massive Dnipro's hydroelectric dam, completed in 1932, became a symbol of Soviet progress, even as villages downstream mourned the losses of the famine. In cities, a new Soviet generation was emerging, educated in technical schools and universities, loyal to the party and often unaware of the full extent of the recent horrors in the countryside. In Western Ukraine, meanwhile, economic hardship and political repression under Polish rule continued to drive both legal activism and underground resistance. Ukrainian cooperatives, reading clubs, and sports societies became spaces where national identity could be nurtured quietly, away from the gaze of the authorities. Priests in the Greek Catholic Church worked not only as spiritual leaders, but also as educators and community organizers, keeping the Ukrainian language and traditions alive. By the end of the 1930s, Ukraine's fate once again stood on the brink of upheaval. Across Europe, the drums of war grew louder. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 1939, a non-aggression treaty between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, contained secret protocols dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, the Soviet Union moved in from the east, occupying Western Ukraine, territories that had been under Polish control for 2 decades. Many Ukrainians welcomed the end of Polish rule, but Soviet annexation brought its own wave of arrests, deportations, and political restructuring. Those who had worked for Polish institutions, former army officers, and nationalist activists were targeted by the NKVD. Tens of thousands were deported to Siberia and Kazakhstan. Land was redistributed according to Soviet collectivization models, and Ukrainian schools were reopened, but now under strict Marxist-Leninist curricula. Churches were pressured, newspapers censored, and political parties dissolved. The boundaries of Ukraine had shifted again, but the iron hand of Soviet control had merely extended further west. The stage was set for the next cataclysm, the German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. For Ukraine, this would mean yet another brutal occupation, another cycle of shifting rulers, and a struggle for survival unlike any before. But as the 1930s closed, the land lay under a heavy shadow, scarred by famine, repression, and political partition. Its people carrying both the memory of lost freedoms and the hope, fragile but unbroken, that one day the blue and yellow flag might fly freely again. The summer of 1941 began with the hum of bees over sunflower fields, the smell of ripening grain in the warm air, and an unease that rippled beneath the surface of daily life. At dawn, on June 22nd, that unease shattered into the roar of artillery, the scream of engines, and the metallic thunder of tanks. Operation Barbarossa, Nazi Germany's massive invasion, had begun, and Ukraine, with its vast plains, rich farmland, and industrial heartlands, lay directly in the path of the onslaught. The Wehrmacht advanced with terrifying speed. Luftwaffe bombers struck Kyiv, Lviv, and other cities in the opening hours, targeting rail junctions, airfields, and communication lines. The Red Army, caught off guard and hampered by Stalin's refusal to believe intelligence warnings, suffered devastating losses in the first weeks. Entire Soviet divisions were encircled in colossal cauldron battles at Uman, Smolensk, and, most disastrously, at Kyiv, where over 600,000 Soviet soldiers were captured in September. Villages along the Dnipro and across the steppe saw columns of retreating troops, mingled with streams of civilians pushing carts loaded with whatever they could carry. For many in western Ukraine, the arrival of the Germans was at first greeted with a complex mixture of fear, curiosity, and, in some cases, guarded hope. The memory of Soviet purges and deportations in 1939 to 1941 was fresh, and some believed, or wanted to believe, that German rule might allow a revival of Ukrainian independence. The organization of Ukrainian nationalists, AUN, particularly its Bandera faction, AUN-B, sought to use the German invasion as a stepping stone to sovereignty. On June 30th, 1941, in Lviv, AUN-B leaders proclaim the restoration of a Ukrainian state. But within days, the German authorities arrested Bandera and other leaders, making it clear that they had no intention of supporting such ambitions. Nazi policy in Ukraine was driven not by partnership, but by exploitation. Hitler and his planners saw Ukraine as the breadbasket of their envisioned empire, a land to be stripped of resources, its cities subdued, and its population reduced to a pool of laborers and servants for the Reich. The general plan, Ost, envisioned the eventual Germanization of Ukrainian territory, with millions displaced or starved to make room for settlers. Occupation brought brutal realities almost immediately. Jewish communities, vibrant and deeply rooted in Ukraine for centuries, were targeted in the Holocaust. In late September 1941, after the Germans captured Kyiv, a chilling order was posted around the city, instructing all Jews to gather at a specific location. Over 2 days, September 29th to 30th, Nazi forces and local collaborators marched more than 33,000 men, women, and children to the ravine of Babin Yar, where they were shot in one of the largest single massacres of the war. Across Ukraine, from Lviv to Kharkiv to smaller towns like Berdyhiv and Kremenchuk, similar scenes unfolded. Ghettos formed, deportations carried out, and mass shootings executed in fields, forests, and pits. The German occupation carved Ukraine into administrative zones. Reichskommissary, Ukraine in the center and south. Galicia under the general government, and areas in the east under direct military control. In all zones, food requisitioning drained the countryside. Grain, meat, and other goods were sent to Germany, while rural families were left with barely enough to survive. The Hunger Plan, a deliberate policy to starve millions in the occupied Soviet territories, hit Ukraine hard. Villages were stripped bare. In cities, bread lines stretched for hours, ration cards barely covering a fraction of daily needs. Forced labor became another hallmark of occupation. Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians, often young men and women, were rounded up and sent to work in German factories, farms, and mines as Ostarbeiter. They were transported in overcrowded trains, given meager rations, and kept under strict surveillance, marked by badges identifying them as Eastern workers. Many never returned. Those who did carried the physical and emotional scars for life. Yet, amid oppression, resistance took root in multiple forms. In the forests of Volhynia, Policia, and the Carpathians, partisan units harassed German supply lines, sabotaged railways, and ambushed patrols. Soviet partisans operated under Moscow's direction, while Ukrainian nationalist formations, such as the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, UPA, sought to fight both Germans and Soviets, aiming for an independent Ukraine. This three-way struggle often turned brutally against civilians, with competing groups accusing villages of collaboration and punishing them with executions or destruction. In western Ukraine, the UPA expanded in 1943, particularly in Volhynia, where they engaged in a violent ethnic conflict with the Polish population. What began as sporadic attacks escalated into massacres, with tens of thousands of Polish civilians killed and subsequent retaliations claiming Ukrainian lives. The deep wounds of this period would cast long shadows over Ukrainian-Polish relations for decades. The tide of war began to turn in late 1942 and 1943. The German defeat at Stalingrad marked a shift in momentum, and Soviet forces began pushing westward. In Ukraine, the Battle of Kursk in summer 1943, the largest tank battle in history, set the stage for a sweeping Soviet offensive. By November, the Red Army had recaptured Kyiv after fierce fighting. The city left heavily damaged and its population reduced to a fraction of pre-war numbers. The liberation of Ukraine was not swift or bloodless. German forces dug in at strategic points like the Dnipro River, defending cities such as Kherson, Mykolaiv, and Zhytomyr with desperate tenacity. Villages changed hands multiple times, each shift bringing new waves of requisitions, arrests, and killings. Soviet partisans, emboldened by the advance, coordinated with the Red Army. But civilians often bore the brunt of reprisals from retreating Germans. By late 1944, most of Ukraine was back under Soviet control, though the war raged on in the Carpathians as the Red Army pushed into Central Europe. The final months brought renewed tragedy. In western Ukraine, NKVD forces clashed with UPA fighters, beginning a post-war insurgency that would last well into the 1950s. The return of Soviet rule meant not liberation in the Western democratic sense, but a reinstatement of one-party control, accompanied by purges of those accused of collaboration or nationalist sympathies. The human cost of World War II in Ukraine was staggering. The Holocaust, forced labor, famine, and reprisals. Some 6 to 8 million Ukrainians, soldiers and civilians alike, perished. Entire towns were reduced to rubble. Infrastructure lay in ruins, and the land bore scars from trenches, bomb craters, and massed graves. In the war's aftermath, Soviet Ukraine was both a victor's territory and a wounded land. It had endured the full force of 2 totalitarian regimes, each imposing its own vision with ruthless efficiency. Fields would need years to recover, cities decades to rebuild, and families generations to heal from the loss. But as 1945 closed, the red flag flew once again over Kyiv, Lviv, and Odessa, and Stalin's USSR entered the post-war world with Ukraine firmly within its borders, a position that would define its fate for nearly half a century to come. The first post-war winters in Ukraine were as cold and heavy as the silence over ruined streets. Snow gathered in the shells of buildings, and winds swept through windowless factories where machinery stood frozen, waiting for power that would take months to restore. The Red Army had driven the Wehrmacht out, but it had left behind a landscape stripped bare, bridges dynamited, rail lines twisted, and harvests stolen or burned. In Kyiv, Kharkov, and Dnipropetrovsk, entire neighborhoods were piles of bricks, the air thick with the smell of charred timber long after the fires were gone. The Soviet state moved quickly to reassert full control. NKVD units roamed the western regions, not to fight the Germans now, but to root out remnants of the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, UPA, and suspected nationalist supporters. In Galicia, Volhynia, and the Carpathians, the forests still hid armed men who had fought both Nazis and Soviets, and now carried on a bitter guerrilla war against Soviet authority. Villages that harbored or were suspected of harboring insurgents face mass arrests, deportations to Siberia, and the destruction of homes. By the early 1950s, tens of thousands had been killed or exiled. The armed resistance slowly strangled through attrition, informants, and brutal counterinsurgency tactics. At the same time, Moscow launched vast reconstruction campaigns. The fourth and fifth five-year plans channeled resources into heavy industry. Factories in Donbass that had been dismantled or destroyed were rebuilt with machinery shipped from the Urals or even from East Germany as war reparations. Coal mines were restored and expanded. Steel mills in Mariupol, Kryvyi, and Zaporizhia roared back to life. Hydroelectric plants along the Dnipro, such as the Dnipro's Dam in Zaporizhia, destroyed by retreating Soviets in 1941, and again by the Germans in 1943, were rebuilt. Their turbines once more spinning power into the grid. The cost of this rapid industrial revival was carried on the backs of workers and peasants. In the countryside, collective farms, kolkhozes, and state farms, sovkhozes, were reimposed and expanded, often swallowing what little private plots villagers had been able to keep during the war. Grain quotas were rigid and high, leaving little for rural families. The drought of 1946, combined with these requisitions, led to famine in 1946 to 1947 that claimed hundreds of thousands of lives in Ukraine, particularly in the southern oblasts. Officially, the famine was downplayed or denied. In villages, it lived on in whispered memory. Housing shortages in cities were severe. Families crowded into shared apartments, kominakas, where one kitchen might serve 3 or 4 households. Bathhouses were communal, privacy a rare luxury. Yet, step by step, Ukraine's urban centers rose from their rubble. In Kyiv, new boulevards, lined with Stalinist neoclassical facades, replaced war ruins. A Chrushotic street, flattened during the German retreat, was rebuilt as a showcase avenue, its stone buildings adorned with columns and sculptures. Politically, Ukraine's status within the USSR was complex. It was one of the Soviet Union's constituent republics. The Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, Ukrainian SSR, and in name, had its own government, parliament, and even a seat at the United Nations, which Stalin had arranged in 1945 as a way to increase Soviet influence in the new international body. In practice, the Communist Party of Ukraine answered to Moscow, and decisions on policy, economics, and culture were shaped by the Soviet central apparatus. The post-Stalin era brought changes. When Stalin died in 1953, a wave of cautious optimism swept through Ukraine. His successor, Nikita Khrushchev, who had deep ties to Ukraine, having served as party boss there in the 1930s and wartime, initiated a period of de-Stalinization. Political repression eased somewhat. Gulag prisoners were released, and public discussion of past abuses, while limited, became possible. Ukrainian cultural life experienced a partial thaw. Writers, poets, and filmmakers explored themes of national history and rural life with more openness, though always within the boundaries of socialist realism and Soviet ideology. Khrushchev also pushed large-scale infrastructure projects. In agriculture, his Virgin Lands campaign sent thousands of Ukrainian youth east to plow fields in Kazakhstan. At home, he promoted mechanization and the building of prefabricated apartment blocks, the Khrushchevkas, to alleviate housing shortages. These plain, concrete structures lacked ornament but could be assembled quickly, allowing families to leave cramped communalkas for their own private flats, however modest. One of Khrushchev's most symbolic acts regarding Ukraine came in 1954. When Crimea, until then part of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, was transferred to the Ukrainian SSR officially. The move marked the 300th anniversary of the Treaty of Pereslav, when Cossack hetman Bohdan Khmelnytsky had pledged allegiance to the Russian Tsar. At the time, the transfer was largely administrative. Within the tightly bound USSR, the internal border between Russia and Ukraine carried no great political weight. In later decades, it would become one of the most contested legacies of the Soviet era. The Brezhnev era, beginning in the mid-1960s, brought stability of a sort, but also stagnation. Leonid Brezhnev himself had served in Ukraine during the war and as a party official afterward. And under his rule, the Ukrainian SSR remained a vital industrial hub of the Soviet Union. Donbas coal powered Soviet factories, and Ukrainian steel, machinery, and ships supported both civilian and military needs. The space industry flourished in Dnipro, where the Yuzhmash plant produced rockets that became central to the USSR's space and missile programs. Life for many urban Ukrainians in the 1970s was materially better than in the harsh post-war years. Salaries were steady, housing was more available, and consumer goods, televisions, refrigerators, and eventually small cars like the Zaporozhiets became more common. Vacation trips to the Black Sea coast were a treasured perk for workers who had saved enough and could get vouchers through their trade unions. The cultural scene, however, grew more constrained. After the relative openness of the Khrushchev thaw, the Brezhnev years saw renewed pressure on dissent. Ukrainian writers and intellectuals who pushed for greater recognition of the Ukrainian language or criticized Russification policies faced harassment, job loss, or arrest. Russification, the promotion of the Russian language and culture over local identities, was a subtle but persistent feature of Soviet life in Ukraine. Russian was the dominant language in government, industry, and higher education, especially in the eastern and southern cities. In Kyiv, Kharkov, and Odessa, Russian language schools often outnumbered Ukrainian ones, and speaking Ukrainian in professional settings could mark a person as provincial. This linguistic and cultural shaping deepened regional divides that would later play a role in Ukraine's post-Soviet politics. Even within these constraints, Ukrainian achievements stood out on the Soviet stage. The film studio in Odessa produced popular comedies and dramas, and Kyiv's Davzenko film studios became known for historical epics. Athletes from Ukraine excelled in Soviet teams, from Olympic gymnastics to weightlifting. In music, the rich choral traditions and folk ensembles of Ukraine remained beloved, even as official programs favored performances in Russian. The shadow of Chernobyl fell in April 1986, shaking Ukraine and the entire Soviet Union. The explosion at Reactor No. 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, north of Kyiv, near the town of Pripyat, sent a plume of radioactive material into the sky. In the first hours and days, Soviet authorities downplayed the disaster, delaying evacuation of Pripyat until 36 hours after the explosion. Firefighters and plant workers who had rushed to contain the catastrophe suffered lethal doses of radiation. Contamination spread across Ukraine, Belarus, and beyond, forcing the permanent evacuation of a 30-kilometer exclusion zone. Thousands would suffer long-term health consequences. Chernobyl not only exposed the dangers of nuclear technology, but also the flaws of a system that prized secrecy over public safety. The late 1980s brought the winds of perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost openness under Mikhail Gorbachev. In Ukraine, these reforms allowed suppressed topics, the Holodomor famine of 1933, the repression of the Ukrainian language, and the environmental damage of industrialization. Civic groups formed from cultural societies to environmental movements like the Green World Association. The Ukrainian People's Movement for Perestroika, known as ROK, began as a cultural revival and soon took on an openly political character, advocating greater autonomy and eventually independence. By the close of the Cold War, Ukraine stood at a crossroads. 4 decades of Soviet rule had rebuilt its cities, industrialized its countryside, and bound it tightly to the Soviet economic and military system. Yet beneath the surface, national identity had endured. In songs sung quietly at family tables, in the persistence of Ukrainian speech in rural areas, in the memory of struggles past. When the Soviet Union began to unravel in 1991, Ukraine would not simply drift away. It would step forward with a declaration shaped by centuries of survival under empire and occupation. The summer of 1991 in Ukraine was warm. The wheat fields stretching gold under an open sky, yet the air carried an unease. Across the Soviet Union, old certainties were unraveling. In August, a failed coup in Moscow by hardline communists against Mikhail Gorbachev shook the already weakened Soviet state. Crowds in Kyiv gathered in squares, waving blue Ondielo flags that had been banned for decades. On August 24, 1991, the Ukrainian parliament, the Verkhovna Rada, declared independence. The vote was nearly unanimous, even among many who had spent their careers within the Communist Party. Outside, bells rang and people embraced, some weeping openly, aware that a chapter measured in centuries might finally be closing. The referendum on December 1st confirmed the will of the people. Over 90% voted for independence, with majorities in every region, including the traditionally Russian-speaking East and Crimea. That same day, Leonid Kravchuk, the former Speaker of the Parliament, was elected Ukraine's first president. Weeks later, Ukraine, along with Russia and Belarus, signed the Belovezha Accords, formally dissolving the Soviet Union. The red flag came down over the Kremlin, Q. The blue Ondielo flag was raised over the parliament as the anthem. Shaini Vamirla Ukraina returned to public life. Independence came with immense challenges. The Soviet economic system that had sustained Ukraine's industries collapsed almost overnight. Supply chains that had run through the vast Soviet network broke apart. State-owned factories in Donbass, Dnipro, and Kharkiv struggled to adapt to market conditions. Pensioners sold vegetables or trinkets in open-air markets to survive. In agriculture, the end of collective farms was gradual. Land was distributed to workers in the form of shares, but without clear legal frameworks or capital for investment, productivity often fell. The once prized black soil fields yielded less, while imported food, for those who could afford it, filled urban shelves. The early years also saw the birth of Ukraine's national institutions. The armed forces were formed from Soviet units stationed on Ukrainian soil, inheriting not only conventional weapons, but also the world's third-largest nuclear arsenal. Ukraine faced a profound choice: keep the nuclear weapons as a deterrent, or surrender them in exchange for international guarantees. In 1994, Ukraine signed the Budapest Memorandum with Russia, the United States and the United Kingdom agreeing to give up its nuclear arsenal in return for assurances of its sovereignty and territorial integrity. At the time, it seemed a pragmatic step toward integration with the global community. Culturally, the 1990s were a time of rediscovery. Ukrainian language publishing, suppressed or marginalized during Soviet rule, expanded. Schools increased instruction in Ukrainian, and universities began to reframe history courses to include events once omitted or distorted. The Kievan Rus heritage, the Cossack Hetmanate, the 1930 to 1933 Holodomor famine, and the independence struggle after World War II. In Western Ukraine, where national traditions had been kept more openly alive, folk festivals and church holidays flourished. In the East and South, the process was slower, complicated by the stronger presence of Russian language and Soviet nostalgia. Politically, the young republic navigated between competing visions. President Kravchuk faced pressure from nationalists to assert full sovereignty in all spheres, and from others to maintain close ties with Russia. Economic crisis and public dissatisfaction led to his defeat in the 1994 presidential election by Leonid Kuchma, a former Soviet industrial manager from Dnipropetrovsk. Kuchma campaigned on promises of economic reform and closer relations with both Russia and the West. Under Kuchma, Ukraine adopted a new constitution in 1996, establishing a semi-presidential system and officially declaring the country a unitary state with Ukrainian as the sole state language. That same year, the hryvnia replaced the coupon karbamid as the national currency, stabilizing inflation after years of financial chaos. Yet, while some economic sectors began to recover, the era also saw the rise of oligarchs, powerful businessmen, who amassed fortunes by acquiring state assets during privatization. They built political influence through media ownership and patronage. Foreign policy in the 1990s was a balancing act. Ukraine sought integration with European institutions, joining the Council of Europe in 1995, while maintaining critical economic ties with Russia, especially for energy imports. The Black Sea Fleet, inherited from the Soviet Navy, was divided between Russia and Ukraine in 1997, with Russia securing a long-term lease for its naval base in Sevastopol, Crimea. The agreement temporarily eased tensions over the peninsula, but left unresolved undercurrents. Socially, the decade was marked by contrasts. In Kyiv, Lviv, and Odessa, galleries and nightclubs brought a new cosmopolitan energy. While in mining towns and rural villages, unemployment and poverty deepened, labor migration began to rise. Ukrainians traveled to Poland, Italy, and Portugal for work, sending remittances back home. In the Carpathians, small-scale tourism began to grow. In Crimea, the beaches still drew summer crowds from across the post-Soviet world. The media landscape shifted rapidly. Independent newspapers and television channels emerged, though many were tied to oligarchic interests. Investigative journalism grew, but so did political pressure. The 2000 murder of journalist Georgy Gongadze, who had exposed corruption, shocked the country. Recordings allegedly implicating President Kuchma in the case sparked mass protests. The Ukraine without Kuchma movement, which, while ultimately suppressed, revealed growing public frustration with corruption and lack of accountability. By the turn of the millennium, Ukraine was still defining its place in the world. The economic freefall of the early 1990s had slowed. GDP began to grow again after 2000, driven by metallurgy, chemicals, and agriculture. Cities like Kyiv saw construction booms, with new glass and steel office towers rising alongside Soviet-era apartment blocks. Mobile phones and the internet began to connect Ukrainians in ways unimaginable a decade earlier. Yet, beneath these signs of modernization, the old tensions remained between East and West, between visions of Ukraine as a European democracy or as a close partner to Russia, between the legacies of the Soviet past and the aspirations of a new generation. In this balancing act, the next great turning point, the Orange Revolution, was already taking shape in the political winds of the early 2000s. By the early 2000s, Ukraine's streets felt different, more crowded with cars, more alive with satellite dishes and neon signs, more confident in their own rhythms. Yet, in the end markets, conversations often turned to corruption, oligarch dominance, and the sense that politics was still a game played behind closed doors. The 2004 presidential election would put all of this into sharp focus. That year, the race was between the sitting Prime Minister, Viktor Yanukovych, backed by outgoing President Leonid Kuchma and many Eastern industrial elites, and opposition leader Viktor Yushchenko, a former prime minister with a reformist pro-European platform. Yushchenko campaigned on fighting corruption, strengthening democracy, and integrating Ukraine with Western institutions, while Yanukovych promised stability, close ties with Russia, and continued economic growth. In September 2004, Yushchenko fell mysteriously ill. His face became swollen and disfigured, later revealed to be the result of severe dioxin poisoning. The source was never definitively proven, but the incident electrified the campaign, turning Yushchenko into a symbol of resilience for his supporters. As the first round of voting passed, tensions grew. international observers documented irregularities. And the second round in November was marred by widespread allegations of fraud. On the night of the announced results, with Yanukovych declared the winner, Kyiv's Independence Square began to fill. First thousands, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands gathered, bundled in heavy coats and scarves against the winter cold. Many wearing orange scarves, hats, and ribbons, the color of Yushchenko's campaign. Tents sprang up across the square. Volunteers brought food and tea. Musicians played. Speakers addressed the crowd from a stage. The protests were peaceful but unyielding, a round-the-clock presence that became known as the Orange Revolution. For 17 days, the square became a small, self-sustaining city. Students skipped classes to camp there. Pensioners came during the day to join the chants. Families brought their children to witness what they felt was a historic stand for democracy. Under intense domestic and international pressure, the Supreme Court of Ukraine annulled the fraudulent results and ordered a rerun of the election. In late December 2004, Yushchenko won the revote, and his ally Yulia Tymoshenko, known for her braided crown of hair, would soon become prime minister. The Orange Revolution was celebrated as a victory for people power. But the years that followed revealed the difficulties of turning street unity into lasting political change. Yushchenko's presidency began with high expectations, but was hampered by infighting between him and Tymoshenko, economic challenges, and entrenched corruption. The coalition that had filled Independence Square fractured into competing factions, and disillusionment grew among voters. Economically, the mid-2000s were a mixed picture. Ukraine's GDP grew rapidly from 2005 to 2007, fueled by steel exports, agriculture, and foreign investment. Cities like Kyiv and Donetsk saw real estate booms. Upscale malls opened. Luxury cars appeared on the streets. Yet wealth was unevenly distributed, and rural areas lagged behind. Labor migration continued, with millions working abroad, sending back billions in remittances that kept many households afloat. Ukraine's foreign policy remained a tightrope walk. The Orange leaders sought closer integration with NATO and the European Union. But these ambitions clashed with deep economic ties to Russia and divisions within Ukrainian society. Gas disputes with Russia erupted in 2006 and 2009, leading to supply cuts that left parts of Europe shivering in winter and underscoring Ukraine's vulnerable position as a transit country for Russian energy. Culturally, the period saw a flowering of Ukrainian language media, pop music, and film. The Eurovision Song Contest victory in 2004 by Ruslana, with her high-energy wild dances, gave Ukraine a burst of international visibility. Young people in Lviv, Kharkiv, and Odessa embraced both global trends and local traditions, mixing rock concerts with folk festivals and skate parks with poetry readings in coffeehouses. Yet, political instability persisted. Parliamentary elections in 2006 and 2007 reshuffled alliances, with Yanukovych returning as prime minister in a power-sharing arrangement with Yushchenko. The global financial crisis of 2008 hit Ukraine hard. The hryvnia lost value, unemployment rose, and many who had taken out dollar-denominated loans found themselves unable to pay. By the 2010 presidential election, public disappointment with the Orange camp was widespread. Viktor Yanukovych, portraying himself as a stabilizing force and appealing to voters in the industrial East and South, narrowly defeated Yulia Tymoshenko in a runoff. The Orange Revolution had changed Ukraine's political culture, proving that peaceful mass protests could overturn fraudulent power. But it had not delivered the deep reforms many had hoped for. As Yanukovych took office, Ukraine stood once again at a crossroads, caught between European aspirations and the gravitational pull of Moscow, between the lessons of recent history and the challenges still to come. By the early 2010s, Ukraine's cities hummed with contradictions. In Kyiv, glass-walled business towers cast their reflections over centuries-old churches, while in the countryside, time still seemed to move at the pace of seasons. Under Viktor Yanukovych's presidency, there was an initial appearance of stability. Roads were repaired, state salaries paid on time, and international relations kept in a calculated balance between Moscow and Brussels. But beneath the surface, corruption deepened, and the quiet hopes for European integration, nurtured since the Orange Revolution, still lived in many hearts. In 2013, those hopes were tested. Negotiations for an association agreement with the European Union, which promised closer trade ties, reforms, and visa liberalization, had been years in the making. By autumn, the government appeared ready to sign in Vilnius. Yet in late November, just days before the summit, Yanukovych's administration abruptly announced it was suspending preparations, citing pressure from Russia and the need to improve relations with Moscow. The reaction was swift. On November 21st, small groups of students and activists gathered on Kyiv's Independence Square, Maidan Nezalezhnosti, carrying EU flags and banners calling for Ukraine to Europe. Social media amplified the message, and within days, the crowd grew into the thousands. The protesters were young, hopeful, peaceful. They sang songs, drank tea from paper cups, and set up small tents against the winter cold. The movement came to be known as Euromaidan. In the early hours of November 30th, riot police units, the Berkhat, moved in to disperse the camp. Batons swung. Students were beaten. Blood pooled on the cobblestones. Images of the crackdowns spread instantly, sparking outrage across the country. By the next day, the Maidan was filled not with hundreds, but with hundreds of thousands. People came from Lviv, Kharkiv, Odessa, and rural villages, some traveling all night in old buses to stand in the square. Now, the protest was no longer just about Europe. It was about dignity, justice, and the right to decide Ukraine's future. The winter of 2013-2014 turned Kyiv's center into a fortified encampment. Barricades of wood, tires, and ice rose at key streets. The air was thick with the smell of burning wood and smoke from oil barrels used to keep warm. Volunteers organized kitchens, medical posts, and makeshift libraries. Priests from multiple denominations led prayers on the stage. Musicians played guitars under fluttering flags. There was a sense of community and a shared, stubborn resolve. January brought escalation. The government passed a set of dictatorship laws restricting freedom of assembly and speech. Clashes broke out on Rushevskoho Street, where protesters, wearing construction helmets and holding wooden shields, faced lines of Berkat officers behind shields of their own. The frozen cobblestones rang with the sound of sticks striking metal. Fireworks exploded overhead. Smoke grenades rolled into the crowd. By February, the standoff reached its breaking point. On February 18th to 20th, violence surged. Snipers fired from rooftops into the crowds. Dozens were killed in a single day. Images of protesters falling, shield in hand, onto the icy pavement seared themselves into memory. The death toll climbed past 100. The heavenly 100, as they would be called. Under immense domestic and international pressure, Yanukovych fled Kyiv on February 22nd, later appearing in Russia. The parliament declared him removed from office, and an interim government was formed. The square, still draped in flowers and portraits of the dead, was both a place of mourning and of triumph. The revolution of dignity had succeeded in toppling a president. But the cost was heavy, and the challenges ahead loomed larger than ever. Even as Ukraine began to chart a new course, the country's territorial integrity was threatened. In late February 2014, armed men in unmarked green uniforms, later acknowledged to be Russian troops, seized key sites in Crimea. By March, Russia had annexed the peninsula after a disputed referendum condemned internationally as illegitimate. Russian flags replaced Ukrainian ones over government buildings. The Black Sea Fleet's base at Sevastopol became a Russian stronghold. The crisis deepened in eastern Ukraine. In April 2014, armed separatists, supported by Russia, seized government buildings in Donetsk and Luhansk, declaring people's republics. The Ukrainian government launched an anti-terrorist operation to regain control, leading to fierce fighting. Towns like Sloviansk, Debaltseve, and Ilovisk became names associated with battles and loss. Thousands of civilians fled. Many more lived in basements to escape shelling. The Minsk Agreements of 2014 and 2015, brokered by European mediators, sought to halt the fighting, but clashes continued, freezing the conflict into an uneasy stalemate. For ordinary Ukrainians, life during these years was a mixture of grief, adaptation, and determination. Refugees from Crimea and Donbass settled in cities across the country, bringing new dialects, traditions, and burdens. The army, once neglected, was rebuilt with the help of volunteer battalions and grassroots fundraising. Soldiers received food, clothing, and medical supplies from civilians. Entire communities organized benefit concerts and charity drives. Economically, Ukraine faced severe hardship. The hryvnia lost much of its value. Inflation surged, and industries in the conflict zone were shuttered. Yet civil society surged forward, building networks of NGOs, transparency initiatives, and cultural projects. Ukrainian language, education, and media expanded. The national identity, once debated, now crystallized for millions in opposition to foreign aggression. By 2015, the war in the East had settled into a grinding, low-intensity conflict along a 400-kilometer front line. Soldiers rotated in and out of trenches. Ceasefires were declared and broken. The shelling never entirely stopped. The Maidan, now quieter, still held memorials for the fallen, and across Ukraine, the memory of that winter, of singing in the snow, of holding the line under fire, remained a source of both pain and pride. A reminder that the struggle for dignity was not over, but ongoing. The years after 2015 unfolded like a slow dawn after a storm. Light returning, but with deep shadows still stretched across the land. Ukraine was a country both wounded and awakening, its skyline marked by cranes and memorial crosses alike. The air in Kyiv carried the mixed sense of construction, dust, and candle wax from constant vigils. In every corner of public life, there was a recognition. The old ways had to change, even if change came with pain. Politically, the Post-Maidan leadership faced the monumental task of steering the country through war, economic crisis, and institutional overhaul. Petro Poroshenko, a billionaire businessman known as the Chocolate King, for his confectionery empire, had been elected president in May 2014 on promises of reform and ending the war. His administration, along with parliament, launched waves of changes, some structural, some symbolic. The police were reformed, with the creation of a new patrol force, wearing crisp uniforms and equipped with modern vehicles, replacing the discredited militia. Anti-corruption Bodies like NAB, National Anti-Corruption Bureau, were established, though their path was constantly obstructed by political resistance. The military underwent the fastest modernization in its history. From a force once dependent on aging Soviet equipment, it began integrating NATO standards, improving training, and producing new armored vehicles, drones, and communication systems. This was achieved not solely through government funding, but with massive support from volunteers and diaspora Ukrainians abroad. Grassroots movements like Come Back Alive became lifelines for soldiers at the front, providing night vision goggles, medical kits, and protective gear long before official channels could. Society itself was changing in quieter but equally profound ways. The war and the annexation of Crimea had shifted cultural boundaries. Ukrainian language usage rose in media, education, and everyday life. Russian language channels diminished in influence, replaced by local productions. Historical dramas and talk shows that explored Ukraine's past with a renewed sense of ownership. Cities that once leaned toward Russian cultural life, like Kharkiv and Odessa, saw a surge in Ukrainian language concerts, book fairs, and theater. Economically, recovery was fragile. The IMF and European Union provided billions in loans and aid tied to reforms in energy pricing, banking, and governance. Energy independence became a national goal. Ukraine stopped buying natural gas directly from Russia by 2015, instead importing from European markets via reverse flow pipelines. This was not only a political statement, but a shift in economic sovereignty. Agriculture boomed as one of the country's strongest sectors, with grain exports making Ukraine a breadbasket not just for Europe, but for parts of Africa and Asia. IT outsourcing also flourished. Young Ukrainians in Lviv, Dnipro, and Kyiv built startups, worked remotely for Silicon Valley companies, and launched apps that began to win global recognition. Still, the war simmered in the east. Along the front lines in Donetsk and Luhansk regions, a grinding reality set in. Villages like AVW and Shirukine became half-empty shells, their schools closed, their gardens overgrown, but still marked by washing lines strung between shattered fences. Soldiers lived in trenches reinforced with wood and sandbags, rotating in and out every few months. Even in the capital, the war was never far away. Returning soldiers stood in line at banks, carried shopping bags through markets, and sat quietly in their uniforms, faded from the sun. By 2019, the political landscape shifted again. Volodymyr Zelensky, a comedian and actor who had played a fictional Ukrainian president in the TV series Servant of the People, ran for the real presidency on a platform of anti-corruption, unity, and bringing fresh energy into politics. He campaigned with humor, minimal, traditional advertising, and heavy use of social media, promising to bridge divides and resolve the war. In a landslide victory, he defeated Poroshenko, securing more than 70% of the vote, an unprecedented mandate. Zelensky's early presidency was marked by high-profile diplomatic moves. He sought direct talks with Russian President Vladimir Putin, engaged with France and Germany in renewed Normandy format negotiations, and pushed for prisoner exchanges. Domestically, he advanced reforms in land ownership, digital government services through the Dia app, and infrastructure. Roads and bridges, long neglected, were resurfaced, and airports in smaller cities began to see renovations. Yet beneath these developments, the geopolitical storm clouds were gathering again. Russia's rhetoric grew sharper, its military presence near Ukraine's borders more visible. Disinformation campaigns intensified, seeking to portray Ukraine as unstable, corrupt, and dependent on the West. Inside Ukraine, the war fatigue was palpable, but so was a quiet resilience, a belief, rooted in Maidan and the years since, that the country's path forward could only be decided by its own people. By 2021, Ukraine had signed deeper trade and cooperation agreements with the EU, secured a visa-free travel regime for its citizens in the Shangan area, and expanded its partnerships with NATO. Military exercises with Western allies took place on its territory. New laws promoted the Ukrainian language in public life, while cultural institutions, museums, film studios, art collectives increasingly told Ukraine's story through its own lens, not one inherited from imperial narratives. That same year, the Frontlines saw an uptick in shelling, and Russian troop buildups along Ukraine's eastern and northern borders drew international alarm. In Kyiv and on its trams, people spoke of the possibility of a major escalation with a mix of disbelief and sober preparation. Families quietly updated their passports, stocked emergency supplies, and discussed contingency plans. Soldiers trained harder. Volunteer networks, the same ones born in 2014, refreshed their contacts, readying for what many feared might come. It was a nation that had lived nearly a decade in the shadow of war, reshaped in ways both visible and invisible. Streets in small towns bore the names of fallen soldiers. Murals of Maidan heroes looked down on commuters. Children in schools learned about the Heavenly Hundred as part of their national curriculum. Life continued. Markets bustled. Weddings were celebrated. Music festivals were held. But beneath it ran a constant current of awareness that history was moving quickly and that Ukraine would again be tested. The hum of Kyiv's streets carried an unspoken question. How much further would that test go, and how ready was the nation to meet it? The winter of 2022 began in the pale hush of snow-covered streets, with Kyiv's morning trams groaning through frost and the golden domes of St. Michael's glittering against a white sky. On the surface, life carried on. Office workers huddled in coats. Vendors arranged tangerines in market stalls. Children rehearsed songs for winter performances. But there was an undercurrent in every conversation, an invisible vibration in the air. Along Ukraine's borders, satellite images showed Russian troops massing in the tens of thousands, heavy armor parked like patient predators. Western governments issued warnings. Some Ukrainians packed emergency bags. Others dismissed the idea of a full invasion as unthinkable in the 21st century. Then, before dawn on February 24th, the air was broken by a sound that would etch itself into collective memory: the deep, distant rumble of explosions. Missiles struck airports, military bases, and cities across Ukraine within the first hour. Air raid sirens wailed in Kyiv, Kharkiv, Odessa, and beyond. The news spread faster than the sunrise. Russia had launched a full-scale invasion. Panic and resolve rose together. In Kyiv, traffic choked the roads as some fled westward toward Lviv, while others moved toward military enlistment offices. Banks filled with people withdrawing cash. Pharmacies ran out of basic supplies. In small villages near the borders, families left homes with nothing but bags, locking doors without knowing when or if they would return. Across the country, volunteers began sewing camouflage netting, collecting donations, and making Molotov cocktails. Russian forces advanced from multiple directions: from Belarus toward Kyiv, from Russia into the Kharkiv region, from Crimea into the south. The early days were marked by battles for control of key airports and highways. Yet the invasion met with resistance fiercer and more organized than many outside Ukraine expected. Soldiers, territorial defense units, and ordinary civilians, taxi drivers, students, retired engineers, took up arms or worked in support roles. In Holodomor, the fight for the Antonov airport raged, denying Russia a critical foothold for airborne troops. In the north, the small town of Chernihiv withstood siege and shelling. In the south, Mariupol became a symbol of endurance and tragedy. Kyiv itself braced for encirclement. Sandbags and anti-tank obstacles appeared at intersections. Bridges were mined for demolition if needed. The city's subway system, built deep in Soviet times, became bomb shelters for thousands. Families camped on tiled platforms under fluorescent lights, children drawing pictures with crayons while parents followed updates on their phones. Above ground, the streets emptied except for soldiers and the occasional volunteer bringing supplies. President Volodymyr Zelensky refused offers to evacuate, famously declaring, "I need ammunition, not a ride." His daily video addresses from central Kyiv, sometimes in military green, sometimes in simple sweaters, became rallying points for the nation and the world. His words, recorded against the backdrop of familiar Kyiv streets, carried a steady, unshaken tone, even as missiles fell not far away. The invasion reshaped geography overnight. Millions fled westward, creating one of the largest refugee crises in modern Europe. Trains heading toward Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania ran at full capacity, with passengers standing in corridors for hours. Lviv became a hub, a city of ornate Habsburg facades now filled with humanitarian offices, military logistics, and temporary shelters. At the same time, many Ukrainians abroad returned home to fight, flying into neighboring countries and crossing the border on foot. The siege of Mariupol became one of the war's darkest chapters. The port city, surrounded by Russian forces, endured weeks without electricity, water, or heat. Residents melted snow for drinking water, cooked over open fires in courtyards, and buried loved ones in improvised graves. The drama of the Azovstal steel plant, a massive industrial complex where Ukrainian defenders held out in underground tunnels, gripped the nation. Despite relentless bombardment, they refused to surrender until their position became untenable, emerging into captivity with heads high. As the weeks turned into months, Ukraine's defense stiffened. In April 2022, Russian forces withdrew from the Kyiv and Chernihiv regions after failing to capture the capital, leaving behind devastated towns like Bucha and Irpin. There, the world saw the aftermath. Streets lined with destroyed homes, burned-out vehicles, and the bodies of civilians, some bound or showing signs of execution. The images shocked global opinion and hardened calls for war crimes investigations. The war entered new phases: artillery duels in the Donbas, missile strikes across the country, and a southern counteroffensive. Western nations increased military aid. Anti-tank weapons like javelins and NALAWS, advanced drones, artillery systems such as HIMARS, and air defense units began arriving. Training programs accelerated in Poland, the UK, and other NATO countries, with Ukrainian troops learning to operate modern systems in weeks rather than months. Everyday life adapted to war's rhythms. In cities far from the front, restaurants operated between air raid sirens, and schools moved classes online or into basements. Musicians performed benefit concerts in subway stations. Artists painted murals on the walls of ruined buildings. Volunteers delivered humanitarian aid to liberated villages, where residents emerged from months of occupation to find homes looted and infrastructure destroyed. By autumn 2022, Ukraine launched bold counteroffensives. In the Kharkiv region, a lightning advance liberated thousands of square kilometers in days, sending Russian forces into chaotic retreat. In the south, pressure mounted on Kherson, the only regional capital Russia had captured since February. In November, Ukrainian troops entered the city to cheering crowds, waving blue Undilo flags, a moment broadcast around the world as a rare scene of liberation in a year of relentless fighting. Yet, the war remained brutal. Russia began targeting Ukraine's energy infrastructure, launching waves of missiles and Iranian-made drones at power plants and substations. Winter brought rolling blackouts. In cities, candles flickered in apartment windows, and people warmed tea on gas stoves during outages. Communities organized points of invincibility, heated tents or public buildings where anyone could charge phones, get hot drinks, and shelter from the cold. The invasion reshaped Ukraine's identity in irreversible ways. The shift toward European integration accelerated. The country formally applied for EU membership in February 2022 and was granted candidate status by June. Public opinion polls showed record support for NATO membership. The Ukrainian language, already on the rise since 2014, became dominant in many areas where Russian had long been the norm. Soldiers from every region fought side by side, binding the country's east, west, north, and south in shared sacrifice. Abroad, Ukraine became a symbol of resistance, of democratic resilience, of the will to endure against overwhelming odds. The blue Andilo flag appeared in capitals from Tokyo to Buenos Aires, painted on murals, raised at rallies, draped over balconies. Aid concerts, charity auctions, and political summits all carried Ukraine's name. At the same time, the cost was staggering. Tens of thousands killed, millions displaced, cities reduced to rubble, landscapes scarred by trenches and shell craters. As 2023 began, the war showed no signs of immediate resolution. The front lines stretched across hundreds from the forests of the north to the plains of Zaporizhia. Fighting remained intense in places like Bakhmut, a city whose name became synonymous with unyielding defense despite near-complete destruction. Ukraine continued to receive international military support, preparing for further offensives while defending against renewed assaults. And yet, in the midst of it all, there was life. Farmers planted crops between shellings. Couples married in military uniforms. Children learned to identify aircraft not from textbooks, but from the sounds overhead. Ukrainian literature, music, and film, often created in the very shadow of war, carried forward, blending grief with defiance. The war's end remained unseen, like a horizon obscured by fog. But for Ukraine, the struggle was no longer just about territory. It was about the right to exist, to choose its own future, to tell its own story in its own voice. The people who had stood on the Maidan, who had endured years of low-intensity conflict, who had built and rebuilt in the face of loss, now faced their greatest trial. And in whispered conversations, in bomb shelters, in songs sung quietly in candlelight, in the determined steps of soldiers on muddy roads, one truth carried through: they would not yield. The spring of 2023 came late, the thaw slow to release its grip on the muddy fields of the Donbas. Melting snow revealed the churned earth of trenches, scattered shell casings glinting in the sun, and broken helmets half buried in frost. Across Ukraine, the air still carried the layered scent of damp soil, diesel, and the faint tang of burned metal. The war had settled into a grinding rhythm, no longer the shocking surge of the early months, but a relentless contest of endurance, resources, and willpower. Yet behind that stalemate surface, preparations were underway for the next great push. In May 2023, Ukraine launched a renewed counteroffensive. This one unfolded slowly, methodically, probing Russian defenses along a wide arc, from the forested approaches near Kupiansk in the northeast, through the industrial heartlands of the Donetsk region, down to the sunlit steppe of Zaporizhia. The aim was clear: to break through the fortified lines that stretched like scars across the countryside and sever Russia's land bridge to Crimea. Villages that had endured occupation for over a year were liberated one by one, their streets littered with abandoned Russian positions, their houses marked by shell fire and the graffiti of soldiers long gone. In the liberated areas, the return of Ukrainian flags was both a celebration and a reckoning. Residents emerged from basements, blinking in the daylight, clutching yellowed identity documents and telling stories of silent resistance, hiding partisans in barns, passing information to the outside world through coded conversations, or smuggling bread to those in hiding. Teams of sappers moved carefully through fields, marking and clearing mines that had been sown in staggering numbers. Each safe path cut through a minefield meant farmers could plant again, children could walk to school, and life could take root once more. International support continued to flow, though each new shipment was the product of delicate diplomacy and logistical complexity. Tanks from Germany, armored vehicles from the United States, artillery shells from South Korea, drones from Turkey, all converged on a nation fighting for survival. Western pilots trained Ukrainian counterparts on F-16 jets, a long-debated promise finally coming to fruition. Satellite imagery provided by allies allowed Ukrainian commanders to plan strikes with precision, targeting ammunition depots, bridges, and command centers deep behind the front lines. But Russia adapted to its fortifications grew denser. Concrete dragons, teeth obstacles, deep trenches, and layers of defensive positions designed to slow any advance. Missile and drone attacks continue to reach cities far from the front, keeping the entire country under the shadow of war. The battle for airspace intensified as Ukraine's growing network of anti-air systems intercepted waves of incoming threats, from hypersonic missiles to slow, low-flying drones. Away from the fighting, Ukraine in 2023 was a place of contrasts. In Lviv, brimmed with both locals and displaced people, the smell of fresh coffee and cinnamon buns masking the fatigue in conversations about relatives at the front. In Kyiv, outdoor concerts returned in brief bursts between air raid alarms, and fashion designers held runway shows in subway stations. In Kharkiv, rebuilt libraries reopened with shelves of Ukrainian literature, a quiet assertion of cultural identity in a city once known as a hub for Russian-language publishing. The world's gaze, though shifting to other crises, returned again and again to Ukraine through moments of high drama. Prisoner exchanges bringing soldiers home after months in captivity. Visits by world leaders walking with Zelensky through scarred streets. The explosion that damaged the Kerch Bridge to Crimea, a key Russian supply route symbolizing the reach of Ukrainian strikes. As 2024 dawned, the war entered its third year. The front lines shifted less dramatically, but Ukraine's strategy sharpened. Using new long-range missiles, Ukrainian forces struck oil depots, command centers, and logistics hubs in Crimea and deep inside Russian territory. Each strike forced Russia to stretch its defenses, diverting resources from the grinding battles in the east. The Black Sea, too, became a theater of contest. Ukrainian drones and missiles targeted the Russian fleet, pushing warships farther from Ukrainian shores and opening lanes for limited grain exports despite the collapse of formal agreements. At home, Ukraine's economy bent but did not break. Farmers adapted, planting in cleared fields or shifting to crops that could be harvested quickly if shelling returned. Tech startups moved operations westward, some even finding new markets abroad. Schools blended in-person and online learning, with children in villages near the front studying via video calls from classrooms in safer regions. Marriage ceremonies often took place during soldiers' brief leaves, photographs capturing smiles framed by camouflage uniforms. The resilience of society became one of Ukraine's most potent weapons. Volunteers continued to deliver aid to the front and to newly liberated villages. Mechanics worked in dimly lit workshops to repair damaged vehicles. Seamstresses produced uniforms and camouflage netting. Psychologists counseled children who had learned to distinguish the sound of incoming artillery. Across the country, blue and yellow flags hung from balconies, fluttering in wind that smelled faintly of spring rain and wood smoke. By mid-2024, talk of a long war became the norm in international policy circles. Ukraine's leaders, while still focused on the immediate battle, began to outline visions for reconstruction and the country's place in the post-war world. EU membership talks progressed with reforms in governance, infrastructure, and the legal system. NATO, while stopping short of immediate membership, deepened its integration with Ukraine's military, joint exercises, intelligence sharing, and coordinated procurement. On the battlefield, the summer and autumn of 2024 saw localized gains in the south and east, though at high cost. The fighting in Donetsk's urban sprawl was particularly brutal, with buildings reduced to skeletal frames and streets littered with the twisted remains of vehicles. Yet, Ukrainian forces advanced using precision strikes to chip away at Russian positions. The attritional nature of the war meant that progress was measured not only in kilometers gained, but in the cumulative exhaustion of the enemy as capacity to sustain its operations. As winter 2024 to 2025 approached, Ukraine was a nation transformed not only by the war, but by the way it had redefined itself. Russian influence, once intertwined with Ukrainian politics, culture, and economy, had been severed almost entirely. The Ukrainian language flourished in media, education, and public life. Historical narratives, once suppressed or contested, about the Holodomor, about dissident movements, about the contributions of Ukrainian thinkers and artists, were now central to national identity. In early 2025, as the war continued, Ukraine found itself at a crossroads. The prospect of a negotiated settlement remained uncertain, clouded by distrust and incompatible visions for the future. The front lines, though deadly, were more static than in the early months, allowing some reconstruction in the rear. Roads were repaired, bridges rebuilt, and power stations fortified. Cities scarred by bombardment began to see cranes on the skyline, a quiet sign that life was asserting itself again. Yet, the risks persisted. Each air raid siren was a reminder that the war could reach anywhere, anytime. Amelie's still kept emergency bags by the door. Candlelight dinners were as often a necessity as a romance. The graves of fallen soldiers multiplied in cemeteries, fresh flowers and small flags marking each one. Through it all, the spirit that had defined Ukraine since the first hours of February 24th, 2022, remained unbroken. In the words painted on a wall in Kherson after liberation, simple in blue and yellow, was the essence of the nation's resolve. We are here. We are together. We will not disappear.